Ladies and gentlemen, the 20th of January was a very exciting day this year because it is when Barack Obama finally took office in Washington. And I don't know about you, but I myself certainly stayed up to watch his inaugural speech, which was absolutely wonderful. He is, of course, following in the steps of President George Bush, who will probably go down in history as being the worst American president ever. There are lots of reasons for that title, which I think he has already gained himself, but I'd like to focus on one of the reasons why I think he's the worst American president ever. And this is the disgraceful way in which he and his administration dealt with the national disaster which took place in New Orleans, Louisiana, 3 or 4 years ago. I'm sure you'll remember the very shocking images on television. What looked like third world conditions, victims dying unnecessarily because of a lack of medical care and water, something which was unthinkable, we thought, in the United States. And still today, huge areas of New Orleans still need to be rebuilt. The Bush administration argued at the time that it couldn't possibly have known that the national disaster, the flooding, would have been as bad as it was. But I would refute this because experts carried out a simulation before the flood in New Orleans to see what might happen if there was a serious flood. And they chose New Orleans as the possible target to do the simulation, and they did that because they knew that New Orleans was a very vulnerable city. It's very vulnerable because it's already 6 to 10 feet below sea level. It is surrounded by water on all sides, with the Mississippi River on one side and the lake on the other. Now, because the city is already below sea level, it's protected by a series of flood barriers, or levees as they're called. Now, these flood barriers are 350 miles long and they surround the city. But the problem was that these levees, or flood barriers, were built a long time ago in 1965, and they were only built to resist a Category 3 storm. Storms are categorized between 1 and 4, 4 being the worst kind of storm. Everybody knew that the levees were weak, that they couldn't resist the worst kind of storm, and successive federal governments have known that and have failed to address the problem. In the simulation that they carried out, the experts, they said that there would be about 300,000 people from New Orleans who would be unable to leave the city. This was because they were either too old, or too sick, or too poor. A third of the population of New Orleans actually lives below the poverty line. And two-thirds of the population are black. And I think this was perhaps what was most shocking in the images that we saw on television. And not unsurprisingly, the Bush administration was accused of racism for not worrying about the poor blacks in Louisiana. Given that this simulation had taken place, the experts then got in touch with FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, FEMA. And they told them, given that 300,000 people will not be able to leave the city, you have to make sure that you prepare refugee camps and tents. But none of this was done by the federal agency. In fact, it's this federal agency which perhaps most severely failed the people of New Orleans. Despite being given lots of warning and despite having lots of time to prepare for a possible disaster, they did nothing. And the mess which ensued showed a scale of incompetence and ineptitude right through that organization. They failed to do the basic things which is necessary in in a natural disaster. For example, they failed to give ample warning to inhabitants. Number one. Number two, they failed to evacuate people in time. Number three, they failed to rescue survivors. 4, they failed even to supply food and water. And 5, they weren't able to restore peace and order. Despite being told by the experts that around 300,000 people would be unable to move from the city, they managed to set up a refugee camp in the football stadium, which could only house 15,000. So whereas they should have been preparing to house 300,000, they only prepared to house 15,000. In the event, when disaster struck, 26,000 people turned up to the football stadium. So a good many more than were really able to stay. So conditions were very cramped. It was very hot. There was no food, no water, and people were stuck there for 24 hours and then 48 hours without any help whatsoever. So as we can see, Bush did not do what he should have done. He declared a state of emergency when the hurricane hit New Orleans, which was on the 26th of September. But having declared a state of emergency, President Bush then promptly went on holiday. The flood barriers broke on the 27th, and by the 30th of September, so 4 or 5 days after disaster struck, still there was no help whatsoever. And people were treated in a very inhumane way by police and by the army in the end, because the army had to be drafted in to help. This fueled claims that, once again, that President Bush was a racist president and that he wasn't doing everything in his power to help people in Louisiana. So, in conclusion, I think we can say that this disaster was totally foreseeable, even though the Bush administration claimed that it wasn't. And some of those 1,200 lives that were lost could have been saved. And the Bush administration and its Federal Emergency Management Agency are entirely to blame for the mess. I don't know about you, but certainly when I saw this on the television, I had to ask myself, would this have happened? Would President Bush have allowed that to happen in a largely white area, which is more likely to vote Republican? And now, of course, we can ask ourselves, could that ever happen again, now that we have the first black president of the United States? I'll leave the answer up to you.